Had the chance to catch up with Sean about just about everything, and I asked him specifically if he'd give me a grade on just how well he thinks President Trump is doing. Let's listen in.
It depends on what areas, but I think that the marks are pretty high. I think when you actually look at the results, and as a Republican, as a conservative, when you look at the agenda that he's driven, it's something that Republicans and conservatives alike have talked about achieving for decades now, with the judiciary, the regulatory reform, VA reform, economic reform and tax cuts. All of those things are stuff that Republicans and conservatives have championed for decades, and the president's getting the job done.
Is that an A or an A plus?
I will stick with an A. You got to give a little room to go up.
And when you think about what's happening in Washington specifically, there's a lot of noise around the Mueller investigation in particular, and whether or not there's a direct link between the president and what we've seen happening there.
Well, again, you got to remember what this probe was all about, and it basically comes down to two things. Number one, did Russia and any other state or non-state actors attempt to undermine the integrity of U.S. institutions and specifically our election? And the answer to that has clearly been yes. The second is, was there any collusion within the campaign with Russia or any of its official entities? As someone who is there, I continue to say there was absolutely no. I mean, Hadley, if you go back, the narrative in September and October and November was we couldn't collude with ourselves. We were disorganized. We were disparate in terms of how we dealt with each other. So it's a very interesting narrative that popped up after the president won, after the campaign was successful. But as someone who was there during the campaign, the transition in the first part of the White House, there was nothing that I saw that gave me any pause.
But if this isn't a witch hunt, then what is it?
Well, I think that's why you've seen the president deem it that. We've had 2 years, every single thing in Washington leaks out. And yet there's been no leaks about any actual collusion with Russia. We've seen tax evasion, failure to file as a foreign agent with the Foreign Agent Registration Act, other nefarious things, lying to federal agents, all of which are wrong. But none of that is collusion with Russia.
Do you think that what we saw happen in the midterms was a referendum on the president specifically and his policies?
Obviously, that plays a factor, but I've been involved in politics for 25 years. Midterms are usually much more parochial, much more localized. Are there messages that we need to, as a party, take out of that? Absolutely. I think we need to do better with suburban women. We need to do better with veterans. The Democrats did a phenomenal job of recruiting and messaging to people who have been either in the military or have served, or families that have served. So there's definitely some lessons learned, but midterms are very specific in terms of how they're run, and they're within districts and states that are in cycle. The presidential election will happen in a handful of states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Wisconsin. That's a much different campaign than what was run last time. The president obviously talked about how important it was to maintain his agenda, but he specifically wasn't on the ballot, as he will be in the general.
Walk me through what you think we're going to see when Congress comes back in January, because there's been a lot of narrative in the press so far about how Nancy Pelosi has won, how she's back.
Yeah.
But does this really just play into President Trump's hands?
Politically, I think this does benefit the president. Obviously, as a Republican, I was sad to lose the House, but the reality is that this gives us something to run against. This really juxtaposes that idea of the binary choice that exists within elections. If you want the agenda that delivered 3+% economic growth quarter after quarter, lower unemployment, the takedown of the regulatory state, then you need to vote Republican and for the president's policies to continue.
Hadley, it's fascinating when we listen to an interview and to hear Spicer talking about the fact that perhaps the outcome in the midterm elections with Nancy Pelosi leading the House is beneficial to President Trump, because many have already said that could be the case. But I do wonder whether or not it's beneficial for the American people, because so far what we've seen, even before we get into that actual divided Congress, is one of heated controversy on many issues. And I think of the fight over the border wall at the moment, the threat for this government shutdown that is getting ever so close this week. It doesn't seem as though these two sides are going to be able to work together on any meaningful progress. And the reality of a shutdown is becoming more and more of a reality this week.
Absolutely, Nancy, and I think what we saw ahead of this race for the Speaker of the House position, President Trump was essentially campaigning for Nancy Pelosi, because, of course, what does this mean for him? It means that his base essentially will have a whipping boy in the Speaker going forward, and someone very, very squarely to blame. I mean, it's something that we've heard again and again throughout the last couple of years in terms of that political record or rhetoric. Going after Nancy Pelosi does seem to work for the president. So, of course, I think that Sean Spicer is absolutely correct when he talks about that. that. But he also said a lot of things about the losses in the midterms, about the fact that the Republicans have really lost the plot when it comes to attracting women, especially as voters and as part of their base. That's something that President Trump was able to do in the actual general election, but something that they saw really fall off the radar there in the midterms. And I think it's also very interesting, given the fact that we're seeing this political climate in Washington. We're also hearing, of course, from Senator Bob Corker. He's the outgoing senator from Tennessee, as you know, and he's even suggesting the possibility of a primary fight in the next round of elections for President Trump, and the importance of that, given the fact that lots of conversations surrounding the death of George H.W. Bush about how there isn't a moderate force any longer in the Republican Party. I think that's very, very interesting that you're going to see potentially a primary fight for the president. Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.